First of all, it's been discussed many, many times that the total amount of income that an individual makes or has, and again, this could be income from work or it could be money that they inherited, does not seem to directly relate to their level of happiness. Now, a lot of people take that point and think, money doesn't matter. Other people hear that point and think to themselves, yeah, right, easy to say if you have a lot of money. We'll talk about the interpretation of those data in just a few minutes, but I do want to earmark that finding because I agree that while money or total resources itself does not predict happiness in any kind of direct way, that is not the same thing as saying having very few resources will make you happier, of course. I don't think anyone would imagine that. But it also tends to overlook an important point, which is something that I certainly have learned to appreciate in my life, and something that I especially appreciated when I was a student and postdoc, which is the following. People will say money can't buy happiness, and we'll talk about the buy aspect of that in a moment. And indeed, that's true. If you look at this longitudinal study or you look at other studies that are done on a more short-term basis, once people get past a certain level of income relative to their cost of living, the amount of happiness does not scale with that income. That is, for every additional $1,000 or $10,000 that they earn, they don't report being that much happier on a daily basis. Now, that said, I venture the argument that while money truly cannot buy happiness, it absolutely can buffer stress. And in particular, it can buffer stress in the form of the ability to purchase or pay for goods and services, and in particular services. You're not going to tell me that having children doesn't involve some increase in the demands on your life, less sleep and more demands. And it certainly is the case that if you can hire help to clean, you can hire nannies if that's your thing. You can hire help to assist with babysitting or even night nurses if you're having trouble sleeping that will literally allow you to sleep while they take care of your child in the middle of the night. Often give excellent care, one hopes excellent care, that won't offset some of the stress associated with lack of sleep. So there are a million different examples one could give of this, but I certainly experienced this during graduate school. In fact, I experienced both sides of the equation here. I made very little money as a graduate student. I had essentially no savings when I started graduate school, and I made very little money. The amount doesn't matter at this point, but I could just barely afford rent and my food. I actually opted to live in the laboratory a lot of the time. And by doing that, I had more money to spend on other things that were important to me. Now, I did not have a family at the time, and so I was able to do that, something that not everyone can do. But I made very little money, but at the same time, I was in laboratory all the time, and that's where I wanted to be. And so my level of stress was actually pretty low because I was investing all my time and energy into the very thing that I knew would eventually help bring me more resources. When I moved from being a graduate student to a postdoc, for instance, a postdoc is generally a 3 to 5 year period. So like residency in medicine, where you're no longer taking courses, but you continue to do research. In fact, entire new lines of research. And prior to getting a professorship, my income went up slightly, went up by about 30 to 40%. But because of where I moved and because of the times, my cost of living went way, way up, and I was extremely stressed. So it wasn't my absolute income. It was my absolute income relative to my cost of living. The other thing that one needs to consider when considering income versus cost of living is there's also this notion of peer group, and we're going to talk more about social bonds and connections later. But one thing that I noticed when I moved from being a graduate student to a postdoc was I was a graduate student in a small town where I had access, if I chose, to participate in most, if not all, of the social gatherings because they were all very low cost. People tended to aggregate at the farmer's market on Saturday. Most people wouldn't even purchase anything, at least not the graduate students wouldn't purchase anything. It was just a place to aggregate. People would sometimes play pickup games of soccer or just hang out, have a cup of coffee. There was a volleyball game on Fridays. Sometimes people would go out to eat that evening, which of course cost money, etc. But it was relatively low cost of living, and social connections and peer group interactions were all generated around the same fairly low cost activities. When I transitioned to being a postdoc, I made more money, but cost of living went up. But in addition to that, my peer group tended to want to engage in the same kinds of activities that people in that larger city were engaged in. So peer group has a tremendously powerful influence on whether or not we gauge the amount of money that we have as bringing us happiness or not. And that really speaks to the critical importance of social interactions and certain kinds of social interactions in particular. Now, if any of that was unclear, what I'm basically saying is it's not just about being able to pay your rent. It's also about being able to access the kinds of social interactions that you deem are, quote unquote, correct for you at that stage of life and in the place where you happen to be living. Because if you can meet all the demands of costs of rent and paying your power bill and food, etc., but you are socially isolated because your peer group or those around you that you want to engage with are engaging in activities that you either don't have time for, literally, because you're doing other things, or that you don't have the financial resources for, then that can actually severely impact this rating of what we call happiness. Why am I parsing this so finely? Well, I'm parsing it finely because I think that most of us have heard the outcome of this study from Harvard or the more short-term studies, also many of which are from Harvard. We'll talk about the just phenomenal work from Dan Gilbert's laboratory and other laboratories who have focused on issues like these. And I certainly don't want to take anything away from those results. They're very powerful and important results that really point over and over to the fact that people's happiness does not necessarily scale with income. In fact, it tends not to past a certain level. And yet, I think we'd be remiss. I think actually it would be inappropriate for me to say that the amount of income that one makes is not important. Because if the amount of money that you happen to have or are making does not allow you to meet your basic needs of shelter, healthcare, etc., and or doesn't allow you to access the kind of social interactions that can renew and reset, or I would say directly enhance the kind of neurotransmitter systems and hormones that lead us to feel that we are happy in our life and we're having quality social connections, well, then that's very stressful. And this brings me back to the statement I made earlier, which is, indeed, money cannot buy happiness, but it certainly can buffer stress. And one of the ways that it buffers stress is by allowing options of different kinds of social interactions, options of different types of recreation that one can engage in to access new forms of social interaction, and so on and so on. So we need to be a little bit careful, or at least nuanced, about this statement that money can't buy happiness and that the data support the fact that wealth doesn't determine happiness. I think there is a truth to that, but there's another side to that that I think is less often acknowledged, and that certainly I've experienced, and that I think many of you out there have probably experienced as well.